Okay, so I think the room's filling up. So let's get started then. Good afternoon, everyone. A warm welcome to you from Manila for today's Green Roads webinar. I'm Belinda Hewitt. I'm a Senior Disaster Risk Management Specialist with ADB's Climate Change and Sustainability Department. And it's my pleasure to provide some brief opening remarks for this session on behalf of ADB's Transport Sector Office. So today's event is part of a wider ADB series, which discusses cross-cutting dimensions on issues like decarbonisation, climate resilience, water management, biodiversity, disaster risk reduction, construction materials, and inclusive growth for developing green roads. And these webinar series are actually anchored in the ADB's recently published Green Roads Toolkit and Assessment Tool, which is available online. So today's webinar will focus on the topic of transport network redundancy. And redundancy, along with it, the diversity and the flexibility of transport systems is really critical to ensure continuity and quality of services to people and economies in the face of growing disaster and climate risks. So with this said, I'd like to just briefly cover the house rules for today. I think you saw those on screen. Your microphones will be muted unless you're invited to speak. Please use the Q&A function in Zoom if you'd like to ask a question, and it will be picked up by the moderator and directed to the relevant speaker. So with that, I'd like to now hand over to Terns Henning from the University of Auckland to run the rest of the session and introduce our speakers. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Belinda, and also to all the ADB staff present, and also for all the arrangements. Thank you for this opportunity. Good evening from New Zealand, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are in the world. It's certainly a pleasure to be speaking to you tonight. My name is Terns Henning. I'm a professor at the University of Auckland. And joining me is Eduardo Allen. He's a PhD student at the University of Auckland, originally from Chile. And as you can pick from my accent, I'm originally from South Africa. So Eduardo, you can share for us the presentation and then we can start. Thank you. So we're going to be talking tonight about the contribution of road network redundancy in order to reduce road link criticality. Now, I'm just going to do the supporting act tonight. I'll give a very brief overview of the criticality concept, and starting with the objective of what I would like to cover. Thank you. First slide. To set the context, we realize that we need to improve the resilience of our road networks. However, we also realize that we don't have enough money to make the entire network climate resilience and also resilient to other natural events. Now, not all parts of the road network is equally important. I think you can appreciate that. And that is just because the roads are used for different purposes. Also, the roads carries different risks associated with natural hazards in terms of their exposure, so where are they located, but also how vulnerable they are. So really what we try to do with road or route criticality is to focus on the parts of our road network that matters the most. Now, as I said, there are different dimensions in this road criticality definition. The first one there is what is the road function itself? Is it a main arterial? Is it perhaps a critical link to a hospital? How important is that road to our community? Secondly, is how busy is that road? What is the current traffic flow? And then lastly, how important is that road to our community? So when we do lose the road, what's the impact on the socio-economic factors? Thank you. This is a brief illustration of the climate risk planning process. I'm not going to go through the detail of the flowchart on the left-hand side. I do encourage you to go and look at the recap document that was developed by the HVT program in the UK in Southern Africa. But it does summarize the main steps in climate risk planning or natural hazard risk planning. We firstly want to understand the hazards. We then want to bring in our network and climate data. From that, we will then determine the risk and criticality for the different parts of our network. And with those three elements, we then can define the overall risk of each link that we have and the criticality that will reflect the importance of that link. We then can integrate that information in any road asset management system in order to take the resilience planning a little bit further. So with the next slide, I would like to briefly go over the investment side of things, how we decide where to invest for resilience. And it follows a very similar process to risk management categories. Now, I've got this illustration from one of my colleagues from New Zealand, Hugh Cohen, who also done quite a bit of work in Manila. So what we have in the figure on the left-hand side is we've got the percentage of our assets on the horizontal axis, and then we've got the loss value on the vertical axis. So that is the percentage of our network that we will lose for given storm events or natural hazards. So a 1 in 2,500 year event is, of course, happening very rarely, but then when it does happen, it will be devastating in its impact. The yellow line on the other side of the spectrum is more frequent events, 1 in 25-year events, and we can see that it only causes damage to a smaller part or a smaller percentage of our network. Now, those impacts are then divided into different categories on how we will manage those different risk parts. So starting on the right-hand side, there's a large part of our networks where we can accept the risk, meaning that the risk and the impacts is going to be low enough that we can tolerate it. So we don't need to invest in that part of the network to reduce the risk. On the opposite side, on the left-hand side, we've got the area that will always be damaged. No matter how much investment we do, we're going to find that we get frequent damage and quite significant damage. So the most logical thing to do there, if no investment is going to help, is just to avoid the risk. So this is typically a road that's right next to a river that often bursts the banks and then overtop the road with water. So the sensible thing there is to remove the road up to higher ground. Then I get to the two middle areas, and that's going to be a little bit of the discussion topic tonight. Control would be the part of the network that we can improve the resilience through engineering solutions or adaptation solutions. Those are typically the areas of high criticality, the areas of high return on investments. The next category is perhaps where there's uncertainty. We don't expect huge losses, so our return on investment for resilience will be slightly lower. So typically in that sort of area, we consider transferring the risk mostly through financial instruments such as insurance. Now, that makes a lot of sense, and I think it sort of sits comfortably with us. But when you start applying this in practice, it is quite difficult to know what that boundary is between these different categories. Tonight's presentation will mostly relate to the area under the control management category. Thank you. When we then look at asset criticality or road criticality, there's really two areas. There's number one is how our natural hazards impact on infrastructure, and then secondly, how it impact on the community, direct on the community. Now, we may have infrastructure that will assist the community during events and is supposed to protect the community for certain events. So something like a retaining wall is a good example. For the road network, we do have certain roads that we see as lifelines, where we want those roads to be open in all cases of emergency. So that will be the roads for evacuation purposes. It will be the roads to hospitals, police stations, and other emergency services. On the top end, when we look at the business as usual network and how that can be damaged, obviously there's roads that's more important than others, and those would be classified as more critical. Thank you. When we then look at the criticality framework, and I think these criticality frameworks are fairly consistent around the world. Obviously, they are very specific to a region. So there's certain things in a given topography or socioeconomic aspects that may be more or less important. But I think this is a fairly consistent framework. This particular one I got from a document that Michael Nyala wrote. So it is widely used across the ADB regions. We can see the categories there: economic, social well-being, and then integrated transport. The criticality criteria, whether it's traffic flows, the importance of the road, and then what type of connections our infrastructure give and what type of infrastructure we are talking about. Highlighted in yellow are perhaps the ones that will be relevant to tonight's discussion when Eduardo in a moment is going to start talking about route redundancy. So when we think about route redundancy or the lack of redundancy, those highlighted in yellow is quite important. Obviously, traffic flow, supporting tourism, strategic roads, and then also giving access to particular communities. Thank you. Now, the criticality factors that we normally consider are repeated here. I'm not going to go through that in too much detail. The one that's not highlighted is the one that I perhaps would like to just mention here, although it's not a discussion point for tonight, and that is our dependency with other infrastructure. So that's not discussed tonight, but it is nevertheless a very important consideration when it comes to route criticality and redundancy. So I'll show you a quick slide on what is meant by that. Thank you. What we have here is from the New Zealand Lifelines Committee, and what that shows us are the different sectors on the column headings, the different infrastructure sectors, and then it shows the dependencies on the left-hand side down the list there. So, for example, we see that electricity is widely needed by all infrastructure groups, but certainly quite important in the provision of gas and fuel. When we then look down the column of transport, we can see that transport is dependent on fuel and fuel is dependent on transport. So there's quite a strong interdependency there. The same goes for the other transport functions. When we then look at the community or sector reliance, we can see that everything to do in our community is dependent on transport, less so the banking sector, but health, police, fire, and then most certainly fast-moving consumer good is very important from a transport perspective. So thank you. That was a very quick introduction. I'll now hand over to Eduardo for his presentation.
Thank you, Tunes, for the introduction. Just to talk about first, like the content of my presentation. Well, first, good afternoon, evening, everyone. I'll start talking about the impact of natural hazards on road networks. I will give some real examples. A very general review of some criticality measures, what we use to measure and how we measure criticality. Then a study that was recently published where we quantify the contribution of network redundancy, as Tunes mentioned, and then some final comments. Just to analyze the impact of natural hazard events on the road network, we can see that the road network, roads, bridges, have been affected by different types of natural hazard events. For example, in Kaikoura earthquake in 2016, the damage was estimated in more than 600 million just in the transportation sector, basically reconstruction of roads and bridges. But it's not only limited to earthquakes. In 2019, I was part of the team that evaluated the consequences of Hurricane Dorian in the Bahamas. That was a study from the IDB, the Inter-American Development Bank. That was my first post-disaster assessment. And just in the transportation sector, the damage was estimated at 87 million. Recently, the floodings in Brazil, more than 780 million. Only in the transportation sector. And just as another example, the volcanic eruption in Tonga costed more than 90 million US dollars just in the infrastructure sector. All types of roads were damaged, roads that are more critical, so they had some cascading effects, for example, or roads that were more busy, and the impacts were actually more than just the reconstruction cost. And that actually made us thought on how do we measure criticality, and we went back to the origins of road criticality. Well, the first time we started talking about road criticality was in a completely different concept. It wasn't in transportation asset management, but it was in the context of war, where they wanted to analyze if they wanted to throw a bomb, which was the road or the bridge that would cause more damage to the enemy in that case. But in transportation, it has become a major focus for mitigation planning. So the same idea, if we lose the road, what are the consequences? And literature, you can see that there are a lot of different metrics, concepts. So there's not basically a unique or a single metric that we can all use, because it also depends on what we actually want to measure and what the consequences are. But generally speaking, there are two types of metrics: the ones that are based on transport models, and the ones that are based on graph theory, if we have to divide the metrics in two big groups. The first one, consider transport studies to determine road link criticality. And for example, if we want to measure the impact on the travel time, the user travel time, we can analyze the road criticality based on that factor, or the impact on user experience, congestion model, or as Tunes mentioned, the accessibility provided by those roads to critical infrastructure, police stations, hospitals, just to mention some examples. A completely different trend to measure criticality is based on graph theory. And something that is important to mention here is that these types of metrics can be applied to any single network. It could be a power network, water distribution network, or transportation network in this case. Some famous metrics, for example, between centrality, which measures basically, we take every single node or every single location in the network, and we want to find the shortest path between that node and every other single node, and we see how many times a road is used in those minimum path. So we determine the criticality based on that. Network efficiency, connectivity, or minimum link cut calculation. Those are metrics, just few examples. There are thousands of criticality measures for each of the two types of metrics that I mentioned. And then actually how we actually quantify them, again, two examples are the full scan analysis. So basically, if we want to measure the criticality of each road, we remove that road, we simulate the traffic assignment, for example, and we calculate the consequences. If we want to measure gas emissions, we remove one link, we assign traffic, and we recalculate the traffic emission. We compare it to the business as usual situation, and we can estimate the consequences of disrupting each link. So we can measure the criticality in that sense. A completely different approach is the Monte Carlo simulation, and I just added some playing cards because it's based on the Monte Carlo casinos, where basically we use statistical techniques to with using, for example, random samplings or probability distributions to analyze the consequences. For example, if we want to analyze the disruption of a road network, and we want to analyze the consequences of disrupting 5% of the roads, we can simulate different combinations, and we can come up with an average or with a distribution of consequences. So given that general perspective of criticality measures, we ask ourselves if road redundancy had any role to play in terms of criticality. Should redundant network be more resilient to network disruptions? Can we actually decrease the criticality, or can we decrease the consequences of road network disruptions given, for example, by natural hazards or traffic maintenance, for example? So if we have more redundant network, are the consequences less? So we started this study and we compare two networks. This is based in the South Island of New Zealand, and we compare these two networks. On the left-hand side, we see the state highway network only, and on the right-hand side, we see what we call here the combined road network, the state highways plus the local roads. By local roads, I mean mostly secondary and tertiary roads. We didn't add the urban roads. So we basically focused on a more interurban context. So we wanted to compare these two big two networks and see basically the consequences of disrupting it. So we ran two different analyses. The full scan, we basically removed link by link, a segment of road by segment of road. We assigned traffic again, and we calculated the metrics that I will explain the next slide. But that was the first approach. So we wanted to calculate the criticality of each road by the consequences of removing that road. And the second approach, to analyze the contribution of the redundancy, the contribution of the secondary and tertiary roads, we set different percentages and we ran Monte Carlo and we calculated the consequences. For example, we disrupted 5% of the road network randomly, and we calculated the consequences. When I said 5%, we ran each percentage several times. I think it was 500 times to come up with a distribution. So some metrics that we measured in terms of the transportation-based metrics, well, the vehicle operational cost, travel time cost for users, and gas emissions in terms of money, right? Hydrocarbons, carbon monoxide, nitrous oxide, and particulates. And in terms of the graph theory metrics, we measure between a centrality, distance to big urban areas, and average node degree. All of them basically, each metric has, of course, their own like formula and everything, but I didn't add it here. So in terms, something that we observed, basically these are the results of between a centrality. In red, you can see basically the roads that are more critical in terms of how many times they are being used in minimum or in the shortest path between all of the combination of nodes. It also matches with this, which is the State Highway 1, one of it's basically the New Zealand main highway. But again, this metric between a centrality could be applied to any network. It's not attached to any type of network necessarily. Of course, I have to measure the minimum path, and I do that based on the minimum travel time. But other than that, it remarks in both cases the less redundant and the more redundant network a little bit, in both cases, the State Highway 1. Then another measures that we another metrics that we measure, distance to big cities. If we want to measure criticality, for example, in terms of how isolated are the different communities, well, one metric could be, let's say, the largest cities. I think I defined large city for New Zealand, more or very close to 50,000 people. So we have 4 in the South Island, and we measure criticality in this case based on the distance to big cities. Then this is something that we actually see the impact of redundancy. So we had let me just go back a couple of slides. There's 3 metrics that were actually quantified in monetary terms. So vehicle operational cost, travel times for users, and gas emissions. So we calculated business as usual daily expenditure for the whole South Island, and then in the scan when we removed each link one link at a time, we could calculate the new cost, and we could calculate, for example, that particular road would produce an increased overall cost of almost 30 millions per day. So basically, if we disrupt that road, if we remove that road from the network, just considering that we have the state highways, we would have a total increase of basically 13 millions, considering, for example, the cost of the people that are taking longer every day to get to their work, the extra gas emissions, the extra tire consumption, for example, and that 13 million decreases to almost 4.6 million if we have a more redundant network. And actually, the most critical road link, it's in a completely different location. As you can see, if we only consider on the left-hand side, if we only consider the state highways, disrupting that road would produce a huge rerouting. But given that we have the redundancy close to that road provided by the secondary and tertiary roads, actually it's not that critical. And the most critical road link in that case actually changes, and that change actually produce very less critical, still critical. If we disrupt that part of the road network, we would have an increase of 4.6 New Zealand millions New Zealand dollars per day of that road being disrupted. The same thing. This is in the percentage and the Monte Carlo simulation. And in this case, we consider that some trips at some point of travel time increase were actually canceled if the user would take longer than a certain number of hours. So we can see, for example, just in the commuting combined road network. So just on the left-hand side, I just want to stop in the commuting time, and I want you to see the 2 blue lines. The first one, the dashed line, is the state highway only. So we can see, and if we compare that to, let me see, I can maybe do laser pointer. Okay, that's good. So for example, I just want you to stop because it's basically the same phenomena on all of the metrics. But for example, if we see the commuting time, this one, the dashed line, is the state highway only. We can see that with very few roads that are being disrupted, we have a huge increase in the travel time, while in the combined road network, we see that the increase is not that much, and we can tolerate more road disruptions. So that we can see the kind of the same effect in all of the metrics. So a more redundant network would produce not only less effect on the total impact, but also that we can tolerate a larger percentage of road being disrupted. In other words, if we have a natural hazard event affecting a very redundant network, we can kind of tolerate, generally speaking, of course, more roads being destroyed. On the other hand, if we have a very a network with basically no redundancy, the impacts will be catastrophic. So as you can see, we evaluated this for commuting time, tourism, freight, and also the gas emissions. And then we wanted to compare the two metrics, the metrics based on graph theory. In this case, we just selected, I think, between a centrality, and then we compare the metrics for each road, the criticality for each road in terms of the increased cost. We normalize both of them by 1, and unfortunately, we didn't find a very good match. That means that the two metrics, or what is critical for between a centrality, is not necessarily critical for the criticality in terms of potential increased cost, which actually made us realize that depending on what we want to measure with the criticality, we may define that some roads might be more important than others, and basically all depending on what we want to measure, right? And some general final comments that I would like to comment. Basically, based on the results, increasing redundancy in the road network will produce a reduction in expected consequences, and therefore in road criticality. Redundant network, again, generate more alternative routes for areas of interest, making them less susceptible to being isolated. And there was an example in the Kaikoura earthquake where a township was isolated because the main roads were actually closed. So in that case, we were talking about isolating people that would have a several consequence. And then the final thing that I said, when we actually want to compare different criticality measures, at least in those two that we compare, we found a very weak correlation. And that basically demonstrates that different methods will actually lead to different results and different investment decisions at the end. Because, for example, if we want to invest in resilience and we base our decision only in terms of between a centrality, for example, we would get completely different results as if we do it based on increased cost or any other potential metric. Well, I just want to say that this was part of a study in the context of my PhD, and the paper was recently published. Joseph Costello and James Henning are my supervisors, and I'm so happy that we share this with all of you, and happy to take some questions.
Thank you very much for that, Eduardo. You can stop sharing. We're going to go to the first question, but just for the audience, if you can use the Q&A button, it's on the bottom of your screen. You will see the question mark there. Please enter your questions for Eduardo and myself. We're going to try our best. I just have to apologize for Joseph Costello. He's a little bit unwell tonight. He would have joined us for the Q&A session, but he couldn't make it. So while you're thinking and typing up your questions, I think I'm going to take two questions that came in from Ian Greenwood. Eduardo, this one is definitely for you. There's a challenge around network modeling when you've got these dead-end roads, and what is happening with the traffic if that road is broken through a natural event. So did you handle that in your analysis at all?
When you say like a dead end road,
Yeah, dead-end road, and then you lose that road. So what do you do with the traffic? Because it is a difficult one to put in a model, right?
it was considered, and in those cases we just well, we had a canceling trip model, and that was one of the, so basically if users couldn't make the trip, it was considered as a canceled trip.
Okay.
And that was, yeah, it was considered in the modeling.
Okay. Right. And just maybe if it's going to be easier for you to verbally ask the question, just put up your hands. We're going to give you a speaking slot in the middle. Excuse me. So the second question that I have is really around the benefit of this process. So what really is the benefit in bringing in your secondary roads into the redundancy calculation? Is that to understand how to deal with disasters, or is it really to help with high capacity roads for non-redundant links also?
Right. Basically, we wanted to analyze the consequences of disrupting the. So what happens if state highway is disrupted, right? Given by, for example, a natural hazard event, and we could see which road links were more affected in terms of new heavy loads. And for example, you can use that to say, okay, this alternative road, in case of these so many roads being disrupted, will have an extra traffic load, and you can actually probably a road that wasn't designed for heavy loads, but then given that that road will actually give you redundancy in a case of a natural hazard event disruption, you can actually invest in maybe like reinforcing that road.
Good, thank you for that. We've got an excellent question from Krishna. He said the redundancy is good, but then question whether you examine the cost for increasing redundancy, such as actually building the alternative roads against the cost of reconstruction of your disrupted road itself.
That's a very good question. We did not analyze the cost of adding a new road and how much that would potentially decrease the consequences, but that's something that definitely we can do with the model. That can be done, but we at least in that paper we didn't add the building the new road consequence. We just compare the state highway only with the already existing secondary and tertiary roads, but adding a new road can be in the model. You can calculate the benefits in terms of the reduction in consequences, and then you can kind of like calculate the cost of construction and analyze that.
Yep. Good, thank you for that. Now, in this research, we've got a question from John. He's asking whether you considered bridges at all as part of that, improving bridges or strengthening bridges to ensure redundancy, or was it only the road links that you looked at?
It was only the roads. However, I just want to state that we didn't use any fragility curve, for example. So when we ran the disrupting link by link, it was not considering the probability of disruption, for example. So we just removed a link, and that could have been a road or a bridge. So basically, we disrupted sections of the road network with bridges, tunnels included.
Okay, we've got another good one from Krishnan, and this is a bit of a clarification. There is the thought that cost would be more intuitively when a broader network is disrupted rather than the state highways alone. But I think your research actually looked at this from the other angle of if I get a disrupted network looking only at the state highways, I'm going to have more delays and things compared to if I've got more redundancy through adding the local network. So can you just maybe expand on that a little bit more?
Yeah. When we the two networks have exactly the same origin destination matrix. So the number of trips is exactly the same in both cases, unless the roads, the trips are being canceled. But what happens is that with the more redundant network, the rerouting is shorter. Therefore, the consequences are less. So if we have a less redundant network, and basically if you disrupt the only way that you have to get, or not the only way, but like the way that you usually use for the shortest path between is disrupted, then given that you don't have that many redundancy, the reroute would be actually longer.
Yes. Okay. He acknowledged that he understands the concept now. So thank you for that clarification. While we're waiting for perhaps another question to come in, I've got a question just on the application of, now that you looked at these different methods, what sort of decisions would you be able to assist in with understanding the redundancy of only the state highways versus using also your wider networks? So how would you apply this?
Okay. A first thing that I would do is to identify those alternative roads that are being more exposed when a road from the state highway network is disrupted. And I would start like probably paying attention to those roads. For example, if they are able to carry heavy loads, yeah, I would start with that. And then at the investment process, probably I would combine this with the normal deterioration of roads for when I have to invest. I would make sure that the most critical roads are less fragile to being disrupted.
Good. Just on that same topic, and I think you've mentioned it briefly before, a big part of this equation is the ability for your secondary roads to actually carry the traffic. So what's your suggestions around that area?
So my suggestion would be, well, again, to analyze which of the secondary or tertiary roads are being more exposed to potential heavy loads, and then I would suggest actually to reinforce those roads that, given in the case of a natural hazard, will be actually used for like carrying the heavy loads. Yeah, that would be my suggestion.
So you've almost got a choice. So it's not necessarily an or question, but how much should you invest in your primary network resilience, and how much
Yeah,
you could enhance your secondary road network to take that traffic on a short time
that's
basis.
correct.
Yeah, okay, fantastic. I've got a good question here from Michael. What sort of effort is involved with the modeling, especially what data do you need to start the analysis? We are conscious that in some developing countries, you don't always have all the data that you need. So how difficult is this analysis, and what sort of data inputs do you require?
I think I was very lucky because we had the origin destination matrix, and I know that that's something that it's not everywhere. Other than that, for example, I use the information from OpenStreetMaps, and I think that's very used worldwide. In practice, I coded this in Python. I think given just to create the network, just the OpenStreetMaps is enough. But then we have the origin destination matrix. We have the different models. For example, the models that we use for the gas emissions were the ones calibrated for New Zealand, although there are other models that are that could be used anywhere. But these ones were actually calibrated for New Zealand. The traffic model is the traffic assignment model is just a user-based equilibrium that is basically just coded in Python. But I would say that the most difficult thing would be the origin destination matrix.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you then want to roll it out to different countries, what will it take? Do you believe there's perhaps commercial software that should pick up this, or do you think there's tools that can be based in Python or in OpenStreetMaps, or how would you do the implementation?
There are things that could be calculated very quickly given the road network from OpenStreetMaps, and that's everywhere. For example, the betweenness centrality, that's very easy to calculate, and basically all of the graph-based criticality measures, very easy to replicate and calculate. For the other ones, it would require more effort. For example, as I said, the origin destination matrix, but it could be easily implemented probably in a software. I have it in a Python script with everything, but could be easily adapted to anything. Nowadays, Python could be used in a lot of softwares.
That's right. Now, Eduardo, as supervisor, we want you to finish your PhD, so we did need to control a little bit on the scope of your research. But I've got a question here from Ian Greenwood that just how hard would it be to actually expand the analysis? For example, to get a group of links that get disrupted, or maybe two parallel roads that get disrupted. So how easy is it to transpose this into a more significant type analysis?
It's very complicated given the total number of combinations that you can have with when you say like two different roads. So if we have a network with, let's say, 100 different links, if we want to run the criticality analysis, removing one by one, you will need 100 simulations. But if you want to analyze all the potential consequences of two different roads, you will have 100
With the power of two, right? Yeah.
100 to the power of yeah, two probably, or 100. And then so if you do like 3 different roads, if you want to analyze all of the potential consequences of disrupting 3 different roads, it becomes impossible at some point. What you can do easily is to analyze different scenarios. So if you tell me I want to disrupt these links and you give me scenarios with each scenario with a limited number of roads, predefined roads, I can run the scenario.
That is easy. Thank you very much. I'm handing back to Belinda. Thank you, Eduardo.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks very much, Terence and Eduardo. Yeah, really interesting findings and discussion today for all of us. So just to close this session now, I'd like to let everyone know that all the presentations will be uploaded to the Development Asia website for the Green Roads webinar series, and we'll pop a link to that website in the chat. The next Green Roads webinar will be held on the 10th of October, and that will be on navigating change, the evolving landscape of the road sector in Asia, with Sudhir Gupta, who's the team lead of the Asian Transport Outlook. So with that, thank you everyone very much for your good participation today, and wishing you a very nice rest of your day. Thank you. Goodbye.